Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another exciting episode of Universal You. Today, we will be discussing the fascinating topic of yoga. From a metaphysical and mystical perspective, we are now going to delve into the incredible insight that can be gained from the state of yoga. In the previous videos, we've been discussing the chakras, and that discussion was exceptionally necessary in order for me to discuss yoga. So I'd advise that you keep in mind all of the information I've shared on the chakras when I discuss yoga now. Let's get into it, shall we? All right, there are multiple different types of yoga. And for the purposes of this particular discussion, we will be talking about the five major classical branches of yoga. All right. But before we do that, let's just get into what yoga actually is. How do I say this? The main goal of yoga is an absolute state of consciousness or a union with universal mind. Yoga is a state of mind that could be considered an absolute state of consciousness. All right, synthesis of the conscious mind with that of the power and presence of eternal cosmic consciousness within. That synthesis is a state of mind which is regarded as yoga. All right, the five classical branches of yoga we will be discussing today is Hatha Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and Raja Yoga. All right, I'm aware that there are many other types of yoga, but these are the classical branches, and I feel that they are rather extensive. So let's get into it. All right, in terms of modernized Western civilization, Hatha yoga is probably the most recognized of the yogas or yoga systems, as it were, because it uses physical postures to stimulate psychophysical chemistry and breathing exercises to awaken the chakras. This is probably the yoga that, if you're not particularly experienced in this type of thing, you're most familiar with. And that's all right. Let's move on. All right, this is a yoga system I'm particularly fascinated in. When we were discussing the chakras, I placed special emphasis on the heart chakra for this reason. And what I'm going to go into now is Bhakti Yoga, yoga of the heart. All right. Bhakti awakens the mind through the heart. It's for the type of person who naturally responds to the best idea of love. During the practice of Bhakti Yoga, normal, ordinary love becomes divine or eternal love. This is when you understand the underlying benevolence of the universe. Through love of the idea of higher consciousness, the student of Bhakti Yoga develops a unity between the conscious mind and the heart center in the unconscious. This unity results in the experience of eternity. I've devised a very simple, I'd say, technique for Bhakti Yoga, which I've included in my dissertation, and I'll include it here in a future video for those of you interested in it. All right, here we go. Karma Yoga. This is the more mystical or yogic interpretation of karma, and it has more to do with a sort of devotional way of life. Let's go into it. Karma Yoga was developed by yogis with the end goal of absolute consciousness, as with all yoga. But it is intended for people who are actively engaged in the everyday world. All right, this is like business people. Karma yoga is not necessarily for your monk living in a monastery in Tibet, but it's more for people functioning in the working world. And in this system of yoga, all good done or experienced is credited to one's true self as cosmic consciousness within, rather than the personal ego, and all unwanted occurrences are released to the peace of the universal mind within. Over a period of this type of living, the mind is emptied of the personal ego, and finally there is a mental opening sufficient enough for cosmic consciousness within to enter. What happens is that cosmic consciousness consumes the conscious mind so that an absolute state of consciousness may take place. Now onto Jnana Yoga, which is best suited for people with philosophical curiosity. Through speculation on life's great mysteries, the mind bypasses the analytical process and becomes part of the intuitive flow of its own consciousness. The intellectual faculty becomes exhausted enough to allow cosmic consciousness to occupy it, culminating in a mystical experience. All right, let's go into Raja Yoga. Raja Yoga deals directly with utilizing the conscious mind to guide inner consciousness to awakening the deepest aspects of the mind. The sublime flow of the conscious mind harmonizes with the unconscious mind to set the stage wherein the absolute mind may be experienced. Raja Yoga. This is very, very indicative of meditation or the occurrences and processes of meditation. In summation, although I've mentioned the 5 classical forms of yoga, in this day and age, any practice that causes synthesis of the conscious mind with the power and presence of eternal cosmic consciousness within could be considered yoga. In my recent studies, I found that personal growth attained from accessing the Akashic records and performing astral time travel could be indicative of yoga. nearly because a lot of personal growth happens when doing this. In that regard, doing what you love, expressing yourself in artistic forms like song and dance and what have you, could also be considered a form of yoga. And based on my recent research, I would definitely say that Tantra is a form of yoga. Very important to do what you love. I think that's what this highlights because it does involve a lot of personal growth and could be considered a form of yoga when the ultimate goal of your endeavors is the state of absolute consciousness, which is, of course, yoga. All right. This is just a very brief overview on the metaphysical psychology of consciousness. And if you're really interested in learning more and going into a bit more detail than I've mentioned here, then I would suggest reading up on Swami Vivekananda, Swami Vivekananda. That's how you say that. And yeah, thank you for watching. And as always, love yourselves and enjoy these mudras.